Hello, welcome to section 5.5. Today we're going to learn triangle congruence proofs. Now, remember from last day, Friday in this circumstance, we have SSS, which means side, 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 SAS, side, angle, and angle, angle, side. Those are all the conjectures that work. The two that don't work are side, side, angle, unless it's right, and angle, angle, angle. Now, what we're going to do is go through the homework for the previous day by adding one extra component, which will be the proof. Now, we're actually going to skip A. Well, let's talk about this, and then the next one will actually do a proof. Now, TS bisects MA. So from that, we know MS is congruent to SA. We know MT is congruent to AT. And we know that TS is in both of the triangles. I guess I really don't need that, but I'll put that there, showing that it's on the left triangle and on the right-hand triangle. So what I want to do here is prove that these triangles are congruent, and from that I can prove something else. Say I could prove that these two angles, angle M is congruent to angle A. Now, when I make a flowchart proof, I start with these two given pieces of information. Say TS bisects MA. And underneath it, I write my reason, which is given. I also have my other piece of information, MT is congruent to AT. That's also given. Now, from knowing that TS bisects MA, we were able to find out another piece of information, that MS was congruent to SA. And that was because that's the definition of a bisector. Because a bisector will cut it in half, so we know that has to be congruent to that. Now our third piece of evidence that we can use is that TS is congruent to TS. Now it seems kind of silly to say, but since that segment is in both triangles, we have to state that it's the same. And the reason, we'll just write same segment. Now once we have these three pieces of evidence, we are able to prove that these triangles are congruent. So we use those three to say triangle MST. Now M is going to match up with A, so that's going to be congruent with triangle AST. And that's by, we know all three sides, so the reason underneath we're going to write side, side, side. Now since I know this, I can say that M is congruent to A, which is what our goal was. Angle M is congruent to angle A, and that's because M is the first letter here and A is the first letter here. So it's a little difficult to say. So we actually say corresponding parts, because M and A corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Now that's a lot to write each time, so we're going to shorten this, and we're going to just write CP, CT, C. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, so now let's just take a look. This right here is what we call a flowchart proof. It starts with the given information, and it ends up with what we wanted to prove. All right, here is the next problem. We're given this information, and we want to prove that AP is congruent to BQ. So I'll start writing M as the midpoint of AB and PQ. And that is our given piece of information. Now from that, if I look at the diagram, I'd know PM and MQ are congruent, and AM and BM are congruent. So I'll start this off and say PM is congruent to MQ, and that's definition of midpoint. And then we can also find out that AM is congruent to MB, and that is also the definition of midpoint. Now, two pieces of information aren't enough to show that these triangles are congruent. So we have to look for a third piece of information that's going to be congruent in both triangles. What I know is this angle and this angle are exactly equal because those are vertical angles. So angle PMA is congruent to angle BMQ. And the reason for that is those are called vertical angles. So now we can take all of this information, since we have three pieces, and all three things we'll be able to use to prove the congruence of these two triangles. So the triangles are triangle APM is congruent to. Now this gets a little tricky. A is between the 2 dash and no dash, so that's going to match up with B. Remember, you have to line them up in perfect order. P is between no dash and 1 dash, which would be the Q. Then M will match up with M. Now the reason why these are congruent is because of side angle side. So that's what we'll write underneath. Side angle side. And now from here, we can say, hopefully what we wanted to, is AP congruent to BQ. AP is the first two, BQ is the first two. So AP is congruent to BQ. And that's because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So this is our flowchart proof. We'll do one more and then call it a day. So kite is a kite with Ki congruent to Ti. So we can write that. Kite is a kite with Ki equal to Ti. So the reason we know that is given. So from that, we know Ki is congruent to Ti. That's just given. Now if it's a kite, Te is going to have to be congruent to Ke. And that's just a definition of a kite. So Te, we should have segments if we're talking about congruence, is congruent to Ke. And that's because the definition of a kite and the third piece of evidence, I can see that this side is in both triangles. So IE is congruent to IE, and that is the same segment. All right, so now we have three pieces of evidence, and all three are sides. So we know that these triangles are congruent by side, side, side. So we'd say triangle ITE is congruent to triangle IKE. And from that, can we prove KE is congruent to TE? Well, KE are the last two letters, and so are TE. So we can state this. KE is congruent to TE. And the reasoning is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, hopefully this will help you start your homework. Good luck.